if this is your first introduction to Joe, we did something on his thoughts about Rome and empire recently. But I've known Joe for probably 30 years now, and Joe's worked in American politics. He thinks deeply about what it means to be a citizen in this country and generally how to protect people's rights in terms of their participation in the political process in this country. And as we know, we've had a lot of assaults on the ability for the everyday person to participate in political life. And so now Joe's written the most recently a new book and a bunch of essays, and so we're here talking about this. And I'm really excited, Joe, that you're here and that you're writing about this because it's really important.
Great, thank you very much. Well, I just put out a book called "The Politics of the Ape and Machine," and the subtitle is "Power as Organization." And the whole when you use the word politics today, the problem is it's associated with kind of the reality garbage show that we all kind of look at as politics, and which has all become over time just this whole focus on electoral system, on the election system, and the whole ability to do any kind of politics. The election system is really, if you're going to have democracy, it's definitely a part of that, an essential part of it. But if you don't have anything before that, then you have real big problems. You have to have a whole underneath process of politics where people come together to talk, discuss, educate themselves, and deliberate, and then decide. And that's completely missing from America at this point. We just have an everything's based on elections, and it's based on 36-second commercials, and uh, which is kind of amazing, and then bad social media. I don't know what you want to call it. It's certainly not discussion, which is part of the problem, but which gets to
Meme
the
wars. We could call it meme wars. I think
yeah,
that's really
which
we're
right,
battling very short package concepts that are trying to sway obviously people one way or the other without deep context.
right,
Yeah.
exactly. And so and so the point is, like with TV and the internet, and what I'm saying about the politics of ape and machine is that technology is part of politics, and that's something that we've just ignored for years. In fact, but if you look at most intellectual discussion about it, talk about technology, and if you go back and look, everybody wants to say technology is neutral, and technology is not neutral at all. Technology, when you start adopting different technologies, different media, it starts forming what is the whole process of politics. So, for example, when you had with the American Republic, at the beginning of the Republic, it was 250 years ago, 90% of the people were farmers, and then you had the whole 19th century, which came into industrialization, and then you had and then by the end of the 19th century, only 50% of the people were farmers. And in the last 20 years, when the railroads and telegraph especially came about and allowed the consolidation of the markets for farming, there was a reaction by the people. It was the populist movement, it was called, and it was the farmers trying to decide how they could use this new technology so that it wouldn't disenfranchise them. But they lost, and so today there's only 1.5% of the people are directly tied to agriculture in America, which is quite incredible. So, but we still have a the institutions of government that were formed 250 years ago, and we haven't changed those at all. I mean, if you look at say, and on the federal level, you have the House and the Senate and the Supreme Court and the presidency. Those processes haven't been changed at all. It's still the same thing, and they were very much formed with the limitations of the day, coming together
Technologically
to
seen. Yeah.
coming together and meet. And so and then on top of that, so today you had like at the founding 250 years ago, or not quite, 1789, when the Constitution came into being, it was basically 35,000 people per representative in the House. Today it's 800,000. So to say that one person can represent 800,000 people is just, that's, you can't even start there, because that's just not true. And if you were going to build something today and would say that,
You
most
wouldn't do
people
it.
would, yeah, would
Yeah, you wouldn't
disagree
do
with
it that way, of
that. Right.
course. Yeah.
And then, so then you had industrialization, and the process of industrialization is in itself consolidation, right? You're consolidating resources, energy, labor. It is automatically consolidation. Centralization is not democracy. Democracy is distributed. So you have to have some kind of distributed organization to allow democracy. If it's centralized, it's just not democratic. It can't be, because that process of centralization automatically disallows democracy. So you had then, the whole 19th century industry started coming, and then the 20th century you had ever more industrialization, and then plus you had the beginning of broadcast media with radio and television, which again, that's consolidation of power. When we were kids, there were 3 television networks, just 3. That was like, and people, it's funny because kids today can't even understand that concept.
There was
Um,
radio, though. There was
well,
radio,
first was radio, right, and
and
then right,
and newspapers. Those were maybe the last bastion of democratic discussion prior to consolidation of radio and newspapers, right? Because you had
and
the
so,
concentrated
well, radio I
TV.
would put as part of broadcast, and that started the
Okay.
consolidation. But newspapers definitely were part of the old kind of more distributed system.
Hmm.
So then you had, with television, you had the breakdown of all the face-to-face kind of organization that existed, especially in politics. Like, and the biggest example are the local parties, which are the county parties, which in the American party system. And look, none of what I'm saying is to go and say this was all great, because there were problems all the time, because that is who we are. There are problems all the time. But there were problems with that system, but it was better, more democratic, small d democratic, than we have today. But those all got wiped out. And so then you had the centralization of more and more power, and uh, and you had no ability for people to interact with each other before the elections. And so the whole system became that, just every 2 years or 4 years people would vote, and that was your only real democratic,
Hmm.
you know
Experience,
ability to do
participation.
anything, right?
Yeah.
And
Right.
that just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And we can see that it doesn't work. I mean, so now, I spent a lot of time since I've known you, and you can vouch for this. The first you met me, I said, look, this system is broke, and if we don't fix this system, it's only going to get worse.
Well,
And
I find
I
it interesting too. Yeah. Sorry. I would just interject that when I met you, the internet was born. And I think some of the excitement about the internet at the time when it first started was I was having conversations on the Unix shell, right? Long before the web, the browser was even invented. Maybe not long, but maybe in a year or 2 years.
nothing very long these
But
days. Yeah, exactly.
nothing very long. But the point being that there, all of a sudden, the sort of internet that was created by DARPA and all of that, there were these groups in the East Coast and the West Coast that were jumping onto the Unix shell and talking to each other. And we had email. There was
Right.
email. My email and our URL was actually created on the Unix shell by just saying, I want this email and I want this URL,
Right.
before network solutions and everything. And I remember when I founded my company, Tree Media, was with this idea of horizontal access to information for the very reason that people needed to participate. Right. And of course, I was naive and probably stupid. Or maybe I shouldn't call myself stupid, but I assume that was the trajectory of this new invention, which, as we saw, it became the ultimate tool for the concentration of power, right? So we started with this wonderful idea of horizontal access, the idea of the three television stations. Now all of a sudden we have YouTube and millions of television stations. But just because you exist now doesn't matter because of the algorithm and all the technology and the concentration of information, right?
Yes,
So we've
absolutely. And
really ended up in a weird spot.
right, and absolutely. And I, got into politics in 1980, and I did campaigns for a dozen years, and at and I did a final tried to do final campaign. I've been in and out since, but in '92, where the former governor California Jerry Brown ran, and our whole campaign was about that this system was failing, and we had to do things. Now, what's interesting about '92, and this just shows you how crazy it all. I mean, just how everything's just moving so fast. But '92 was the first um, where cable television played a role in the campaigns. And I was really like, so we were all like trying to figure out because the traditional establishment did not like our campaign. So we had to go outside it. And so I like went after cable in a big way, And so it's interesting, right? So that was from the three networks, and now you went to cable, which opened it up with like things like C-SPAN and CNN, and this was before Fox News even came about. But we spent a lot of time doing as much as we could on cable, and so that was at that point. So when I got done with that campaign, and we were talking about how the established media and certain powers had really become controlling interest of our politics and how you would do that. And when I saw the internet, I instantly thought, like you, okay, this is going to be great. This is how we can do things. And, it'll free up information and the ability to communicate and all those other things. Now, the problem was, and this is very important. The problem was is that the internet was sold because of kind of the way the information, the packets were kind of bounced around various servers. It was sold as a distributed system, but everybody's interaction into it was through a server, and those servers were centralized as the broadcast media. So, as the internet developed, instead of getting a distributed system, you got a more and more centralized system, right? So now everybody talks through these platforms, whether it's social media, Facebook or Google or, whatever the case may be, Instagram. But these are centralized media that are controlled by a very small group of people. And the most interesting thing to show how this has failed, right, is that 90% of Facebook's revenue comes from advertising. So there's absolutely no value. There's no value put into you talking to the other person. So that's the problem. That's a big, big problem. And
Well, it's
again,
interesting. I agree with that. Sorry. I was just thinking that whenever we talk about the valuation of internet companies, we're not building real things in the real world. You're just selling the opportunity to advertise to a human being more specifically because they've, taken all your information, right? But what's the core value? The core value is a human being and it's purchasing power.
right,
And that's where
and
all the capital is concentrated in that. I
right,
guess before AI, but anyway, it's
right, and you
absurd.
look at and you look at the economy today, uh, and these numbers are roundabout, but they're close enough. 70% Fortune 500 does 70% of the economy. They employ 8%. So that means that the other 92% of us are going for the 30% of the economy, which in ways shows you just how like amazingly gigantic the American economy is, but also how it's failing. I mean, there's a, and this has been happening for 40 years too, 50 years really. It's concentration of wealth has become greater and greater and greater in America, but that's because concentration of the economy has become greater and greater and greater. And all of this stuff is has a technological basis. So you've got to look at when you're doing a technology. So for example, like with, social media, which I always hated the term social media, because how can asocial people create a social media? They can't. And we've learned that. But if it's just going to be controlled by those people have tremendous power, and everybody, but they're still selling kind of like the internet idea that, we're individual empowerment and all that stuff, and it's not. And what's missing is, and this is where, I I talk about power is organization. All power is organized. One person is just one person, no matter what. And anybody who has power, it's because there's a bunch of people underneath them that are organized one way or another. And the default organization, especially for the corporation, is a hierarchical organization with a few people in control and everybody else doing what they're told to do. Now, tech has kind of try to say, oh no, we're getting people and we're letting them have their ideas and stuff. Yeah, more or less, but they still are controlled at the top. There's people at the top who are making the final decisions about what happens with everything. That is not democracy. And so if you want democracy, you have to have distributed uh, power. Now, going back to the United States, and this is a really important point. We look at the history of the United States with, well, first was the Revolution, and it'll be 250 years next year, but then with the Constitution, the founding of the Constitution. And the Constitution was about empowering DC. And there was great talk at the beginning of this whether that was a good idea or not, and a lot of people thought that was not a good idea. And Jefferson said when the Constitution came in that eventually all power was going to be in DC. So if you look at 250 years of America, it's about power being taken from the local level and concentrated in DC. And Hannah Arendt, I'll just Hannah Arendt, who was a very brilliant democratic thinker, she talked about the real fault with the American Constitution was it did not include the townships, the local townships, like so we just have DC. And so that is really, really important because it is the townships was where really democracy lived in America. That was where people went in and they had a say and they could decide what was going on. And so that's all been those local over time, both through technology, but especially technology. You have to understand is that, this power that used to be at the local level has all became more and more consolidated during industrialization. And so like the industrialization needed a centralized power authority like DC. And so that's what we got. And that's where we're at now.
Before we move on, I want to mention and underline, I live in the Northeast, where in a hamlet that was founded before the Revolution. We have trees that were planted before, maple trees that are 250 years old or older. And in the cemetery in our small little hamlet are 20 Revolutionary War veterans, all of whom were farmers. And these were the people, as I understand it, that fought the revolution, but then had to go back to their farms while the patricians basically down the road in the sort of the larger town wrote the document. And that was because they could afford to be there. And when one lives in a space like that now, and I come from the big cities, which I would argue through industrialization became the means by which concentration was centralized through cities. The small towns now have the vestiges of this participatory element that you're talking about. But what's fascinating is that the national parties, because they, exist, impact the local politics in negative ways, if you know what I mean. And so what's fascinating here, do you know what I mean? Because you have like the local Republican, the local Democrat, and they obviously are eyeing other offices higher up than the town. very rare to find someone who wants to just stay if they're politically inclined to, to be in party politics. They want to usually advance. So it compromises the conversation at the local level. And what we've discovered, or what has happened, is that there's local parties emerging. I don't know if you're aware of that, but in our town, there's two new parties that are just local, that have their own platforms, that talk a lot about working together and across the aisle and all this stuff, because the this high concentration of power from DC, from these national entities, are causing local people to be incapable of coming to decisions and compromises, right?
Right.
So I find it fascinating you're mentioning this now, just because I'm living through it and watching it. I do have hope, though, for um, this idea of decentralization and concentration of power. And maybe are we, in the face of this hyper concentration of power now with AI that you talk about in your essays, maybe people will turn away from that, and maybe it's the last straw. I'm just wondering.
Well, you place your bets, as they say. But
Yeah.
I look, the possibility is definitely there. And in regarding AI, I mean, I look at AI as just the next step of that. They use intelligence. That's just the marketing term, but it's just the next step of compute power, right? And what it's really going to allow is basically automation. It's going to create an ability to automate even more so, because it's just a kind of, exponential is not the right word, but a leap in the compute power. And so once you have that compute power, you can do more and more and more stuff. But it's the whole thing with democracy is it's not a nirvana by any means, because we are who we are, and I don't think we're going to change anytime soon. But what it does allow is everybody to be part of defining how their life works. And it's collective, and we've lost that, right? We've lost that with America, because it's all become, again, this is part of the commodification thing. Everything's become part of, like, it's you, it's just you, but it's we. Politics, democracy, all politics is not about you. Politics is about we. So that's the whole thing. And we are a social animal. And so how we decide things, how we communicate, that's all politics. And it's hard to use that word. I've discovered, it's hard to use that word today, because as soon as you say politics, the only thing people think of is shit show. And so you got to get people
But
beyond that.
But I wonder, so way back in the beginning of this conversation, you talked about when the farmers, like, again, the hamlet that we talk about that I live in, and the farmers that came out and fought the revolution, and then went back to farming, and then they basically lost their political base because DC centralized it through industrial. Well, besides the fact that they wrote the Constitution in the way that would promote the centralization of power in DC, industry, hyper concentrated capital, and power. How
Right.
do you think one could have kept the political life decentralized in such a situation? Because I think there's an analog now for tech, most likely.
Right. So for two things, no one ever figured out how to democratize industrialization. Nobody. Like
Right.
communist, socialist, capitalist. It's all because industrialization is itself is consolidation. So that's a
Right.
question. It can be done. One of the biggest things is you don't let things get so big. That was the antitrust movement, right? Which came out of the
The
populace.
anti-monopoly,
Yeah,
right? The
yeah,
whole
right.
monopoly, break
The
up the
the whole thing was,
monopolies.
you don't let, like, in the beginning, and this is how our politics is just so screwed up, because the beginning of the antitrust, anti-monopoly thing was completely, again, I politicals political idea, was because these guys knew. See, the farmers of the that were the populist movement, they were democratically enfranchised. They had power at the local level. And what they
Right.
saw with the railroads and the telegraph and the Eastern banks was that power was being ripped out of their hands. You
Correct.
know, where
But what's interesting,
as opposed to
yeah,
today, where we don't have power, so we don't know what it
we didn't
is.
even start with that.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
what's interesting, but how do you though, like if let's just say, and I in econ we learned about when a certain monopoly sometimes is very beneficial because it's hyper efficient and it's actually great and
Yeah, but
prices are low. Hold on.
okay, go
So
ahead.
like, no, I'm just saying like,
Go
is there
ahead.
a world in which you can have, regardless of how big or small companies can become, that the political process runs independently of that, or just that's just naive? Because basically, the
Yeah,
captains of
no,
industry or whoever has the money is going to want to continue the conditions within which they've made all that money,
right.
right?
So,
Therefore,
right,
they exercise
right.
political
So you have to have, and this was like what,
power.
these guys thought about this a little bit, right? The whole idea is that, and if you look through history and you go back to the Greeks and the Romans and things, the whole idea is when you have power, when power and you need it to be democratic, then the body democrat understands when you're giving power to anything that you have to pay attention to that, and that it has to be limited and it has to be in both time and space. And the Greeks
Yeah.
and the Romans understood this very well. Um, so the guys that did the Constitution, they did that too. Checks and balances. And one of the things that has been, and it got lost in history was the states. The states were looked at as the fundamental check and balance to the American Constitution, right? But if you look at the Senate was really a representation of the states themselves. That's what it was supposed to be. So
Hmm.
that's all gotten changed. But what I would say to answer your question, it's very simple. We have to understand that powers like gravity, it likes to consolidate. It likes to, once you have power, more power gets drawn to it. So you have to have, in a Newtonian sense, an equal and opposite force that keeps that consolidation from happening. So that has to be part of politics. You have to understand that that's happening all the time. Like the Greeks, when they had magistrates, and the Romans, 1 year. That was it. You were in office 1 year, and then you're out. And there's a democratic ethos there. It was like it doesn't matter who it is because anybody can play that part, but you just have to watch them when they get in, and you can't give them that much power for that long. So you have to go and look and say, well, how do we redistribute all of this? And part of our politics, a democratic politics, is understanding power.
Well,
And we
yeah, I
don't
think
talk
that's
about
very
power.
important.
We don't talk
We
about
don't.
power in America.
Well,
You know,
besides the fact that the
Culturally we have, but not to a very good
well,
extent,
also
really.
we don't really have we haven't had from We the People 2.0, the movie that I made, what, in 2011, 14,
Right.
somewhere in there. Uh, we've long known we're an oligarchy, not a democracy, because the will of the people hasn't been expressed, in actual laws or what has happened in the country for the last 40 years, unless the elites want that same thing. So unless the population's interests align with elite interests, it just doesn't happen. I mean, we can see that now with Ukraine and all the wars and everything else, highly unpopular activities, but yet it marches forward. There's nothing we can do. So my question really is around um, the the what you think the elite of our country actually want, because it's not I don't think it's just I mean, what do they actually want? Is it just money? I don't know, because
Yeah.
it doesn't seem to
Well, yeah,
serve
both
the
money and power can.
fundamental.
Yeah, both money
Yeah.
and power can become their own ends.
Yeah.
And we've and like so you've talked a little bit about economics, which is really important because economics has been a way to disenfranchise people. It's become a way to go and justify corporate control of the thing. It has little to do with how the economy works because, for example, in the piece I just wrote, externalities. That's what they would call the environmental impact of industrialization. Externalities. This is like in every economic textbook you'll ever see. It's just like, well, we don't really have to worry about that. It's just something that doesn't happen. Well, no, you got to include that. And it also has been very much a justification for centralizing economic power, and I would say, economic power in America today is just as centralized as it was in the Soviet Union at the end, and it's atrophying in very much many of the same ways.
Hmm.
So what you know how it has to there's two things. One of the most important things is that in the last, say, 150 years, in really, you could start out with Darwin, but you know this whole understanding that hierarchical order really doesn't exist in nature, and that order is much more distributed, and it's networked. It's networked together. It doesn't have to go through a hierarchy, but you have a horizontal network. And so that is the most radical concept we have on organization. And it's still very little, right? And you remember, like we were talking about, like the internet, that's what everybody was claiming. Oh, this is this new, we're going to be distributed
Hmm.
order. And what did they do? They destroyed instantly the one software that really did it was Napster. They got rid of that. And now the Bitcoin people are trying to say the same thing, but you're watching just as quickly kind of centralized with these exchanges and things like that. It's just as much centralized as everything else. So
Well,
how do
yeah.
you do that?
Well, it's
And
interesting. You mentioned the Greeks said that knowledge is where you participate, and it also and also I like that sort of part that you said. Also, they exploited the idea of science and knowledge to control you as well. So that's really crazy and interesting. But theoretically, with blockchain and also back with the internet with the Unix shell, I mean, you can still go, you open your terminal. And if you know enough, you can communicate without any of these what we call shrink wrapped programmed spaces, but
right,
people just don't know how to do that. And same with crypto. Like if you could program, you can move around this digital world freely without any of this stuff, right? But people just don't know how to do that, nor do they want to spend the time. And these sort of,
right,
these
right.
islands in this digital world are what causing all this control, right? And that's
But
just because we don't know how to do it
right,
otherwise.
which goes to the whole question of how how technology shapes things. And
Mm,
and again, power is organization. So you have to, that's like with these social media things and everything, they're just ridiculous, because you have to create a distributed organization if you're going to have democracy. And that is not what we've done, nor is there any discussion, which is kind of fascinating, really, right? Because everything that's happening with the digital has basically been just digitalizing what was there. There's no real new
sure.
order out there, right? Can you
Mm.
point to
Oh,
anything that's an
absolutely.
actual new
Yeah.
order? And so,
No, for
and
sure.
why do we not have that? Because we don't have politics, and people don't understand politics. And we have the shit show, and everyone, as soon as they say politics, they go, oh, blah blah blah, and that's universal at this point, right?
Well,
But
that's
you need,
because they haven't experienced any upside. There's been no
yeah, yeah,
upside in
and you need
participation.
actual
Yeah.
politics.
Well, and
And
so how do
so
you get there?
this is what I'm saying to everybody, right? Is the whole start of this is people need to come together face to face, and they need to start talking. That's the whole thing. They have to come together not through a medium, but face to face. And they have to start talking about all this stuff. And then the other thing, and this is what, when I first met you and when we were doing electricity back in California in the 90s, is once you start talking about it and everybody goes, because everything is so centralized, you'll soon find that the problems of the Hudson Valley are similar to the problems in Albuquerque. And the same corporations are there. The same corporations are defining how life works there and there. So once you start talking to each other, you can start going, okay, we have the same problem here. We have the same problem there. Remember what we did in California is once we got cities to start going to renewables, as soon as one learned how to do it, they gave that information to other people, and other people could do it. And then together they can become a force, but a distributed force. So, and I can't say this more, the most radical politics of the 21st century is people coming together face to face. That's all I can say. And then you start from there, and then you build up from there, and then you can figure out how you use this medium and these media that is coming out of the whole digital process. How do you start connecting people through that when they're already face to face? That's how it
Yeah.
has to go, not from the top, not from a bunch of people who are basically asocial trying to tell you how to do things, and all they're doing is selling advertising. But how do you create a politics that is, starts at face to face and then builds up? And literally, I mean, and I'll stop here, but just what is the most interesting thing is, but what it means, I don't know. But, you could say that in the last, 30, 40 years, we've become the first time in human history to understand that we are this people on one planet, and it's just one planet. And that's what it is. And that's just, again, that's a very radical notion that, people don't really understand well, but nonetheless, that's what it is.
Even if everyone meets together, we have things that, like the nuclear weapon system and the army and and military, that are decentralized in terms of the people who are participating as soldiers and airmen and all this stuff. However, the control of these entities is centralized, right?
Yeah.
So how does and people meeting in town halls around the country translate that power to saying, hey, we're not going to go to war in Ukraine, for example? How does that really address the intrinsic power now of the what they call the deep state, which is really the administrative state, right? It's like in the last 250 years, we've developed not just processes that have been centralized, but we have these giant bureaucracies that outlast, presidents, senators, Congress people, and they do what they want to do, and we don't even know what they're doing. Most, as Doge found out, we don't even know what's happening, and then everyone strangely freaked out about that process, which I thought was healthy. To why not take a look under the hood? But everyone just lost their minds. So
Well, I think you
yeah,
got to do it more intelligently. But yeah, I mean, look, the whole thing is about, again, and just going back to my book, the subtitle is Power as Organization. And it's to understand that we have to reorganize. And if you want democracy, you've got to reorganize it. And so what I'm saying is you've got to start from the ground up. And from the ground up is face to face communication. And then you build up from there. And again, it's about how you then network these face-to-face organizations together, and these organizations, they can be multifarious. I mean, there can be all sorts of them, but the question is how you put them together. And what we understand traditionally, traditional hierarchies is, the pyramid shape, and it's to, okay, here you have the top and then you go all the way down to the bottom. But how do you do that so that it's horizontally distributedly networked? That's the question. So what you need to do is start that organization at the bottom and get people going, and then it's how that interacts, and you bring back power into that and out of the traditional hierarchies, right? And that's a question that, it, it's much going to be as part of the doing. It's actually, if you go back, Jefferson talked about having ward republics, is what he called them. And 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 and, the, and that and that was how you participate how you create participatory organization. And his whole thing was you have to just let it start and then it will develop, that. And I think that's part of this, is that we have to understand that this is a process and no one's got a solution that's ready made because we haven't done this before. And I mean, and so what I would say in the short, this is what I would say is like, so then once you start creating these organizations, then you can start interacting with, and first you have to create these organizations, then you can start interacting with the established government, right? And start, one is using your local structures. I mean, that's what America has as an advantage, say, as opposed to a place like Nigeria, right? Is that there's a local infrastructure that's already in place, but it's kind of been abandoned. Like nobody could tell you who their city council person is and things like that. I mean, where you are now, maybe some people can, but in the cities and things like that, so it's like how you re how you repopulate that or re-citizen that, and then once you have those structures, then it's like, okay, how do we bring how do we let these structures start making some of the decisions that are being made at the state and the federal level. And then when you start figuring out how you're doing that, then you start electing people to the state and federal level whose whole job is to bring that power back. You know what I'm
Right.
saying? So,
And the thing, all of this is great, but how do you do it in practice? Because theoretically, it makes sense. I mean, the problem, though, is that we have a system that benefits corruption right now, right? So, not a lot of people are at the state level from, again, from some of the interviews I've done in the past and the movies that we've made, we've shown that state houses get, sort of in the pay of corporates that want certain things happening in states, or we now see foreign governments control a lot of the politicians in our country. So um, wouldn't there need to be a sort of look at the Constitution and maybe go back to the more republic idea, where it's not centered in DC? Because isn't that where this all began,
yeah, yeah,
with
absolutely.
the
That's what I'm saying. But
state versus right?
right, but I'm saying is that, like, but the state again, it's kind of like, um, you know, like a lot of our geographical boundaries are arbitrary. I mean,
Sure.
a lot of the
Yeah.
states, it's just arbitrary drawings, right? Whereas so for another example in this, and this can be a long
Hmm.
conversation and needs to be a long conversation, not with just you and me,
Yeah.
but with everybody. But, like
Yeah.
we need to like, and this, uh, from, ecological thinking and stuff, like we should be empowered, we should be our geographic uh, boundaries should have some connection to the actual physical environment, right? They shouldn't just be arbitrary that we go and draw. So, for example, like a river system, there should be a whole, how government is structured should be around that river system, so that entire river system is represented. You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
Or like,
Well, like Salmon Nation, like the Northeast salmon, they
right.
call it Salmon Nation. Yeah.
Yeah.
I get
So
that.
it's
Well, because a lot of people are dealing with the same issues from yeah, if you're
right. So
dealing with
it's
the
a
same
whole
watershed or all
restructuring.
that stuff.
It's
Yeah.
a whole restructuring, a reorganization again. And what I to me, it's a politics. You can develop a politics that is more exciting than any time in human history. And we have various technologies, and part of that politics is having to is being able to decide on what we do with technology. And like this idea that it can't be stopped, or that there's some kind of deterministic future, that's just completely wrong. And right now we put the future in the hands of a few people who are now saying, now we have a race for AI. Well, there's no race for AI. It's like we have to be much more thoughtful about how we're doing all this stuff, and it's got to be taken out of the hands of a few people whose only real purpose is to make more money through it. That's not good enough. That's not just good enough to have a value of technology. And so all this has to come together. And like I say, like it's all with this information. I mean, it's kind of incredible that we're in the most uh, technologically prolific era in human history, and most of it's just creating more and more bullshit. How is that? That's something wrong. There's something wrong there. That we like just so much bullshit that's going on, and people have no ability to judge what information is real from another. That is a problem. And there's absolutely no way AI is going to tell you the way they've got this set up what is. Like just the other day, one of them, and I think it was Facebook, probably was Facebook, they introduced buying and selling into their AI system, or maybe it was Open AI. But the idea that you're going to get objective information from AI is just ridiculous, because especially if it's controlled by a few people, they're going to want to sell it. That's what they know how to do. So they're going to sell you the information. Whoever goes and pays them, they're going to sell you that information. That's what they do now. So anyway, all these systems, and one of the biggest things is this whole proliferation of information. It's We just don't have the ability to deal with this right, and part of dealing with that is organizing around that and understanding that it's each of our roles to be part of this information system, both in creating it and, or not just both, but all in creating it and communicating it and deciding about it. That's all part of what we are. And that role is the role of a citizen. It's not the role of a producer. It's not the role of a consumer. It's the role of a citizen. And the citizen, they're uh, in the end, their thing is to go and say, okay, I think this, and I am going to, support this, and then that becomes, another value system besides just a monetary value system. And I'm not saying that we're going to get rid of, like, I think markets are great ability to, and they've been around for thousands of years. Every civilization has had markets. The ability to create, and pass forth, put back and forth, physical things, good idea. Markets as information systems, not good. Just they're not sufficient to be information systems. So we have to figure out, and what is an information system from the beginning is government. Government from the very beginning has been an information system, and so we have to figure out how we retool and redo the processes of government, so to deal with all this knowledge and information that we now have. And so, like what you were saying, like with the deep state, for example, it's like lobbying. Lobbying is, you know, leave aside how it, the kind of the control aspect of it, but lobbying is a way to bring information into a system which is completely impossible for like 435 people, say the Congress. There's no way they can know everything that's going on in the world. So you want other people to bring information, but to do it where it's a bunch of handful of corporations who are controlling all that and giving the government and writing the bills. I mean, the lobbyists write the bills for the most part in DC now, which gets me to one last thing. And then, so the part of what we're talking about here, corporate reform is essential to government reform. You can't talk about government reform unless you talk about corporate reform.
Yeah, and I think that when you're talking about what is the first step, what do you think? First
I
of
think the
all, do
first
you
step
think
is
what
for
you're
people,
talking right?
for
But
people to
that's
get
just in
together.
the realm of right. Okay, but then what happens?
Then they have to go and look at, okay, here we are in Chicago or Colorado or New York or whatever. Here are the issues that, you know, are part of everyday life. What are we going to do about it? And then you start putting these organizations together. You have to organize, And so what I'm saying, you have to create chapters, for a better word, everywhere across the country, and then you have to have these chapters start interacting with each other. And and like there's a wonderful book called Democratic Promise, which was written by Lawrence Goodwin, which is about the populist movement of 120 years ago, and that's all 150 years ago. It's all about organization and how these people organize together. And we don't know how to politically organize anymore. So
Well, it
we're
makes a
going
lot of sense. Here's the thing, Joe. We had a world in which face to face was required because there was no digital and there was no phone, there was no TV. So people rode their horses or walked over to their neighbor to talk about the news of the day, right? I mean,
right,
that's what happened. Where I live, there's porches still, right? So people would sit out on their front porch
right,
and after dinner and talk. That's, I think one of the biggest sort of strikes to community in America was the television. And we've heard this before, where
yeah,
people
yeah,
used to be out in their front porch after dinner talking and being in community, but now everyone went inside and watched TV and no one was outside anymore. The front porch went away, and the sort of the new urbanism has the porch incorporated back in, but I don't know who's sitting. I sit on my porch, but anyway. So my concern, or my sort of question for you is it even possible in a digital age uh, for people to change their behavior to meet in public? Now, again, in a small town, we meet all the time. We have tons of committees. People meet all the time. There's committee meetings every week. It's posted on the public website, so you know when they are. They're very active. They cover all sorts of elements of the town. So, unlike being from Los Angeles, and I didn't know any of this stuff, and it felt overwhelming, and that you would never have any
right.
purchase on anything. Here, you do, because you know everybody, right? So I find that to be healthy here. But like I said before, the national parties sort of dip in and put pressure on the local ideas anyway, right? So the environmental committee here is only checking boxes because of one climate law that was passed that they can't think outside the box on, so that's annoying. So it's not only local concerns. So I guess my question is, how do we create a human based democracy in the digital age? I think that's really the question. And then post hyper concentration of
Right.
wealth and political power. Like, how do you
So
even seize that back? And is it even possible with a giant country of over 300 million people? Is that
yeah,
even possible?
I think it's possible, and not only is it possible, it's necessary, and it's not just a giant
Right.
country of 350 million people. It's a planet with 8 billion people, and
Sure.
and so how do you do that? So the first thing I have to say is that the political energy is just destroyed by the present political system. So you've got to get outside that to start out with, right? And how you do that, that's a question. But I would say for people, first they need to start talking to each other, and then secondly they need to start interacting at the local level. And then when you get the local institutions start looking at what these problems are, because we got to look at, you got to expand the idea of what's local, right? And understand that, for example, like Los Angeles, but even in the most rural areas, they're connected by this technology, and that shapes it. So you have a response to what that technology is, good or bad or indifferent. And so you've got to start organizing to get power to be able to go and say, well, this is where we want it to go. And then you have to start connecting to other people and start using the institutions that are there. Again, like one of the reasons that, when we worked together back 30 years ago on electricity uh, in California, was because the system was not doing anything. I mean, if you remember, like everybody was against solar in the 90s. Like the NRDC and the Sierra Club were against solar in California. People don't
Yeah, they were for
remember that.
natural gas. Yeah,
That
they're
was
for natural
radical.
gas. Right.
But so we went outside that, and it was like, okay, now start giving the cities an opportunity to go. And so then all of a sudden the cities could come and go, well, we're going to shift our power to renewable power, and then you just build from there. And what you have to do is build and connect. So you understand specifically that, okay, we can't do by ourselves, but what we need to do is organize so that we can all start moving in this direction. And what I can say again and again, the current political system in this country is broke, it's toxic, it's dysfunctional, it's everything.
Well, I think everyone agrees with that. I
Well,
don't think anyone would argue otherwise.
you'd be amazed at how many people, as soon as you talk about anything, they're still talking about this or that. But most people agree with that at that
Well,
point.
yeah,
But you've got to
yeah.
create something different. That's the whole thing. You've got to create
Right. Well,
something
remember,
different.
most of the politicians, obviously, who are currently around, obviously don't want something different because they're in the system
Right.
and it works for them. So, but again, I would say, I know you live near Chicago, used to live near Chicago, or you should go to a small town and just choose a nice small town and live there. Because what I'm noticing is that a lot of what you're saying and recommending is alive and well. I can only speak for the Hudson Valley, where there's a lot of little towns and there's a lot of meetings, and I'm aware of town meetings, and we even still have Grange halls out here that are active,
Right.
which I find to be an interesting entity that the United States had. And yeah, we have a Grange right local that meets. I mean, not a lot of people, like you say, it's not as thriving as it used to be, for sure. But I think that as we move into the future with serious complaints around our well-being and our ability to be free to express ourselves, the censorship, the destabilization of our cities, there's so many problems that are never getting resolved. And I
Right.
think for me to see just like the collapse of cities in this country should be a warning sign to a lot of people who have for quite some time thought that things were okay, including myself. You used to come and tell me like things are a lot worse than you realize. And once I left LA, I realized, yes, you were right. And at the same time, there is an authentic I wouldn't even use the word grassroots, authentic citizen oriented structure that is still in the American soil, right?
Right.
It's just that not a lot of people are participating in it in the way that is required, the way you're saying,
Right. Right. Well, that's what I'm saying.
and
Like what
that's
we
basically your call to action. That's your call to action. You want people to get out
right,
of their homes and get
just get
engaged
together, and
locally.
then I mean, what we do have in this country is we do have an established local infrastructure of government. We have that. So the thing is yeah. So I would say the first step is getting together and talking about how to do, and the second is taking those local institutions of government and reviving them, and then networking those together. Like what we need to get rid of is the pyramidal structure, right? So it's like we go and say local, and then well, what the local can't deal with, we put it to state level, and then I mean and then what the state can't deal with, we put it to federal level. But instead, let's look at how we network that more distributed and let the cities talk to each other. Again, I'll go back to what we did in California. Once one city switched, all the other ones started talking to them and getting how they did it, and then they started switching. So you can do this. You don't need the hierarchy at the top. The bottom can become its own, foundation, and but you've got to create the organization to allow that happens. And to me, this is like the most, you know, imaginative and kind of interesting and exciting part of this whole thing is that we can redo things that have never been done. I mean, you got to remember, democracy is a historic anomaly. Uh, you had the Greeks, you had the Romans, then nothing for basically, and I'm talking with recorded history and recorded Western history, but in all recorded history, not just, but you had the Greeks and you had the Romans, And then you had the Renaissance, which was basically a rebirth of Greek and Roman thought as far as Greek and Roman political practice, not so much. And then you had the modern Republic era, which began with the United States. In 1776, there were no republics. And today, all monarchies. Today, there's almost
But
no
wouldn't
monarchies.
we
Today, there's almost
wouldn't we
no
just
monarchies. And
sure.
just like what we're talking right now of how to develop a more participatory network democratic system, 250 years ago, the idea of a republic was considered just as radical. Just as
Well,
radical.
shouldn't we talk about the republic? Because right now, in the name of democracy, we gave all the power to DC,
Right.
right? And so, why aren't we talking about a
So,
federated group of states that is still America, but just like, for example, taking the education department back to the states,
yeah, yeah.
taking some of these larger entities that got hyper concentrated in DC back to the states. I
Yeah,
mean, what would that look like? Wouldn't that be more direct?
or even to the local.
Correct.
That's what I'm saying.
Right.
Like,
Or
and then
regions, even
creating,
sub-regional. Yeah.
and you're right, and how
Yeah.
you network the local together to create
Sure.
the, you know,
Right.
that's what we're
So you
doing.
still have
So,
America, but you have these more, because like you said, one congressperson, how can they represent the interests of 800,000 people? So you need these different layers and these different structures to get to ensure that people are free to live out their lives, because that's the other thing, is the
right,
freedom stuff, which I think is really
right, but
important to talk about. Hold on, let me just say, like, because you don't have, like, the more that we've lived into the future with, let's just use COVID, it's the obvious example of how we lost a lot of freedoms, or the Patriot Act and all this stuff, that where we've been losing our purchase on what we can and cannot say, or surveillance on all of the digital. What happens if we decentralize this stuff? Isn't that what you're talking about?
yes. Well, how do you
Decentralizing
do
these
that?
kinds of things.
And
Hmm.
so one thing to understand again, history is about, history tells us how we got to where we're at. It does not by any means tell us where uh, we're going to go or where we should go, but it tells us how we got to. So one of the things with DC is that, and it's an important thing, is that in the at the end of the 20s when the Depression came, and sorry kids were a little history, but you know DC and the New Deal was a reaction to the national economy, national and global economy that had been created since the founding of the country, since the founding of the republic, right? And so this was a reaction that collapsed, that system collapsed, and that was largely a corporate structure. And so what the New Deal did was kind of re-put things together and centralize it all in, because it was a national system. It was a national economy, right? So it was no longer a bunch of yeoman farmers who were connected by going thing. It was an intricately connected national economy. So the New Deal was reaction to that. It wasn't, any kind of, like creating from the ground up. It was reacting to a system. And then that, really centralized political power in, the United States. And so that's where we're at, and again, I would say, like industrialization is consolidation. Consolidation is in and itself not democratic. And there's nowhere in the world that industrialization was a democratic process. The outcomes can be democratic, right? I mean, all of a sudden you can create these systems, and all of a sudden everyone can have this or everyone can have that. But the control of them, there's never been democratic control over those systems, whether it was in, Soviet Union or the United States
Well,
or
it's
China today,
interesting that
for example.
right. It's interesting that the critique that you have of the concentration of capital sounds like a communist critique, but you're saying it's necessary for democracy, which I
Absolutely.
find interesting.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. There go the isms. That doesn't
Yeah,
fit in. Doesn't
I'm
fit
trying
into
to
the
avoid those,
isms.
Lila.
I know, but yeah, but it's obviously correct
But
in
it's
the
what we
sense
know.
that
But it's what we know, you
that's what
know.
we correct. Yeah,
So
yeah,
look for
yeah.
example, like you know, and again, I'm trying to avoid bringing up, but in general, because as soon as you do, it takes over everything. But you know, when Reagan got elected in '80, and that was when my first camp election, that was a very significant shift in America. And that was where the New Deal was done. And, you know, I didn't realize it at that point, but I did one of the last campaigns of the New Deal, which was Teddy Kennedy's campaign. And so that was done. And I didn't, it took me another half dozen years to realize the New Deal was done. And Reagan Revolution came in, and then that was corporate power. Basically, that's corporate power. Corporations are going to be free to do whatever they want. And then the Democrats were out of power for 12 years. And in that 12 years, the political system changed very much, you know. And you know, then Clinton came in, and Clinton was just a capitulation to Reaganism. And so from 80 till 16 till 2016, really, there was no real alternative to Reagan, right? One was Trump, who eventually won,
One was
and
Bernie.
yet is very much part of that system in an obscene way. And then the other one was, you know, Bernie. And Bernie was just like no thinking, just coming from the past and go, oh, we're going to revive the New Deal. And these people had all been all over the place, you know, in little bits and pieces I ran into over time. You know, they all clung on to things. And then Bernie came, but Bernie was just like, okay, he's the only opposition to what is the established corporate power. But he's not
I don't
saying anything.
know.
He's not saying anything new. You know,
I don't buy
he's
that. I think Bernie's just like a lot of other people that made a lot, it fits nicely in the system. But
no, no, no,
I don't
absolutely,
know
no, no,
what
no, absolutely.
he's
But
not some big revolutionary.
no, no, no,
I
no,
actually
no,
think
no. But
Trump,
that's what I'm saying.
I,
The New Deal is not some big revolutionary thing. You know,
no, but
it's a
I would say like
reactionary.
you haven't mentioned MAGA yet. There's. I was just listening to Tucker Carlson talking about the five pillars of MAGA, right? Which a lot of those pillars are what you're talking about. Literally, it's just like no foreign wars. Just America first, and which sounds like
But it's very,
jingoistic.
very.
And so hold on. It sounds jingoistic to people who are deep in political thinking, but at the same time, if you think about what you're trying to say, which is, people need to show up for their communities, show up for the political entity within which they live, rather than be concerned with all these ancillary problems that aren't ours. It's a simplistic way of saying it, but it's kind of the same thing, what you're saying in many ways.
Um, yeah, I
Or you
look. The
can
MAGA
disagree.
thing is very.
I think it sounds similar anyway.
Yeah, yeah, no, no. The MAGA thing is you know, it's very loose. You know, it's like it's to say it's organized is very is well, but to say it's organized is giving it a little more credit than it is. But um, but that grew out of the whole, you know, corporate control of everything. And, you know, the
Correct.
interesting thing about the
Yeah.
Republicans is that, you know, 90% of the Republicans, either they themselves, their parents, or their grandparents were Democrats. You know,
Yeah, of
the
course.
South went from being totally Democrat to now totally Republican.
Right.
And so the base of the which is the MAGA movement, right? The base of the Republican Party has long hated the Republican establishment. I mean, they really don't like them. Whereas the Democrat base, for whatever reason, clung on to the Democratic establishment until recently, until the last 5 years.
Yeah,
And
I would
now, for the
say
first
things have. Yeah.
and the first time in
Sorry.
my
Go
life,
ahead.
a lot of the Democratic base finally realizes that the Democratic top ain't in their favor. So now, what you do with that's the whole question. But again, what both things are, if you're working through DC and you think DC is going to change things, that's a dead end. That's over before it starts. That's all I would say. And so you've got to figure out how you revive actual democracy in America. And that's not reviving DC, and and that's what the DC establishment is now, right? DC establishment
Mm.
is totally about defending DC, where the majority of the country is alienated from DC.
Well, they've
So,
shut themselves down, so
yeah, yeah.
not
Well,
even
not yet. Now
working.
they did that, right? So,
Yeah,
so,
they're shut
but
themselves down.
it's
So
it's hard to like, and I'm trying to avoid this, but I find it gets impossible. But I'm trying to avoid what the shit show is, right? And say, well, you got to step us back from that, and you have to start talking to each other. People need to start talking to each other,
well,
and
that's
then from
very clear.
that,
Yeah.
yeah, and then from that they need to start organizing, and then
Hmm.
organizing in a way that understands, that brings in all these different aspects. Because even though the local, see, like one of the big things was 50 or 60 years ago, like the hippies and stuff were going, oh, we're going to go and we'll just create our little commune out in the middle of nowhere and we'll be good. You can't do that, because we're we're it's not just this country, we're on this planet, and
Yeah,
then
well, the
all
boomers were
these
very
things,
selfish.
yeah, and all these things are very connected, and
I
we
mean,
have
that
to
was
connect,
generation
we
was
have to make a politics that connects in the way that you know uh,
hmm
the world is.
absolutely. I agree. I mean, in the sense that when you say that, the generation, I'm Gen X, but like the generation before us was very self-centered and
Oh,
they pretty much destroyed a lot of what was built prior, beneficiaries of a lot of the previous generations building up the wealth of the
absolutely.
country, and
I
they
mean,
pretty
the
much
boomers.
squandered so much of our national heritage.
Look, the boomers got into politics at a very young age, and a lot of what was the criticism of them was absolutely correct. But the biggest thing is they got in, and for whatever you want to say the American system was, say in the mid '60s when they started coming in, to what it is today, uh, 60 years later, what they're going to leave behind, it's a lot worse. And there's no discussion about that. So it's like, it's a lot worse. And for whatever the faults were of the system that they went into, and there were plenty of them, but it's worse. There's just no
It's
doubt
far
about that.
worse.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think a lot about that. And I actually even considered doing a full documentary on exactly what was going on there, because you literally have, after this generation's sort of major arc, I mean, they're all now retiring, um, and passing on, but like we're hollowed out, everything from the churches to the, the national park infrastructure, everything's gone. Even
Yeah.
companies, they sold off our corporate infrastructure and sold it to other countries. We had a political class that basically sold themselves to other countries to do their bidding. So it's unbelievable. I mean, to me, um, I feel like our small generation, Generation X, has a lot more purchase in terms of building things, because we grew up during the Iraq War. We got left, we were out of college just as everything was falling apart, and sort of the fruits of the sort of the raiding of the American treasure chest was hitting full maximum, and there was nothing left for us. So we started building things, and built those internet companies, I guess, that did get co-opted by Wall Street, I guess. Um, and other things. But again, like when I live up here, I see a lot of our generation, or even the younger ones, building bakeries and crafts and maker culture and all of that stuff. So I do believe that there's a human impulse that is rebelling against this hyper concentration of power that you're talking about. The only question is, what is, I'm fascinated by, and for another day, this conversation is, what exactly, how does this actually happen? And like you said, everyone should meet together
That's
and
the first
go to your
step.
town. Go to your town hall meetings. I guess that's all, that's a good first step.
Or just no,
Go to your town hall.
or organize, get people together and start talking about the world. I mean, literally start talking about the world. I mean, the thing is that we're at this point is America is overwhelmingly just trained as consumers, and the interesting thing is like with all this information, this, with the bullshit of it is, and what has not been looked at nearly enough is, the majority of information that people take in is advertising, and there's necessarily no truth to advertising whatsoever. In fact, a lot of advertising is meant to deceive,
Of course.
buy
Yeah.
this car, you can have sex with this woman, eat this food and it'll be the best thing you ever ate, or whatever the case may be. But that's the
Yeah.
majority of information that people take in is advertising. And we've got to create, you know, associations that deal with how we, um, you know, communicate,
Well,
edit, create, communicate information.
yeah, I
And
say,
that's
right. I
that's
would
what
say, yeah.
that's
Well,
what
then
part of
hats
it is.
off to Joe Rogan and stuff, though, and all the new people that have come on to have 3 hour conversations to break the mold and say, and you don't have to. No one has to listen to what he's saying or talking about, but people obviously are interested in 3 hour conversations about subject matters that matter and not packaged and edited and glossy, this, that, and the other
Right.
through
And
television shows and weird newscasts, So that I think is really changed. And I have a feeling that people are going to start talking about a lot of the issues that are now on limits, not off limits. You know what I mean? A
yeah,
lot of
yeah,
things now can be discussed, which
I hope
weren't
so.
before. And we need to credit the podcasters really for
Well,
busting
I would
through
I would
these
say this about the
norms.
podcasters and the influencers and everything, right? It's all this atomized individuals. Okay. There's no political organization. There's no we. It's Joe Rogan, or it's this guy, or it's that guy. And, it's even like for myself, I just started writing because I had no political outlet whatsoever. So I was like, all right, well, I spent my whole fucking life doing this stuff, so I'm at least going to put out there what I know. And so, but what has to happen is that needs to be, you know, there needs to be, associations. There needs to be not just Joe Rogan, right, right. But it's very, very important, because that goes from being just because it goes from being, quasi entertainment, and a lot of this stuff is quasi entertainment, to where it's actually education, which you can do something with. So
Well,
how do
I
you
was going
do
to
something
say
with it?
it's an entry point. I
Right,
think
right. No,
what
no, no,
these
no. But I'm
podcasters have
just saying.
done has expanded the conversation outside of the highly edited and propagandized filters of
I
mainstream media
agree,
news.
except for the
So,
organized forces are still the corporations and the government.
no question,
There's
no
no other
question.
there's
And
no other
you,
organized
yeah,
force in America today.
right. No, we know that. So we have to basically meet together.
Right.
Okay.
No, that's good. But I mean, like, I think once we start meeting together, then you can start retooling all this electronic media to understand how we then make that where associations can start interacting and how we pass information back and forth with each other and all that stuff. But you've got to create that, face to face to be able to understand how do we do that. And I think most of what's been created at this point is not good. And just like I said, the boomers came in very young and are now leaving behind complete, much worse. The same thing with social media. Social media has been nothing but a disaster for politics. Nothing but a disaster.
Oh, no question.
Yeah.
No question. But yeah, so Joe, where do we go from here? So we'll have another conversation. I have a few other things I want to talk about. But
All right.
the big message is go to your town hall meeting and also just meet about the issues that
Yeah.
you're facing in your town, right?
but not just
And
your town hall. But I mean, that's kind of the second part of it. The first part of it is getting together with people and just starting to talk about all of this. Start to become
mhm.
citizens, and the number one thing for a citizen is to talk to other citizens.
I
That's it.
mean, Joe, why don't you start that? Why don't you go to a town wherever you
Well,
are and
I'm
get some
going around. I'm
people?
doing this. I'm doing these book talks, and I'm putting this out, and so hopefully, people will start
Okay.
doing that. That's. I mean,
Okay.
this is the thing. You don't need any money. You don't need any. You can just go and start talking to each other, and then when you start talking to each other here, you can start connecting with those people there who are also starting to talk, and then you can
Yeah.
start figuring out how we're going to go. What I will say is, without a doubt, if you're going to go see and think that you're going to elect a Democrat or a Republican and that's going to make a difference, you're wrong. That's all I can
I
say.
think people kind of know that.
I
Sadly, I think we
but
are
so
seeing
then
that things aren't
so,
changing. Yeah.
right, so then it's like, okay, so now we got to do something different, and that's, I'm saying, okay, so now
Yeah.
we need to do so, and that's the first step. See, because a lot of people will completely, um, you know, kind of just disregard that. Like they'll think, oh, no, 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 no. But it's very, very powerful. And Americans, and I can tell you this from all over the place, when I brought stuff like this up in the past and say we have to start thinking about this, they immediately want to go, what, how are we going to deal with it? Well, you know what? How
But
we're going to
you,
deal with it
yeah.
is you first have to start talking about it.
Well, you were embedded in Democratic politics for a really long time, and those people had absolutely zero interest in other ideas other than their own or whatever the hip idea was that they all were concerning themselves with. You know
Right.
what I'm saying? Like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
there was a lot more freedom of discussion outside of Democratic circles, right?
A little bit.
I think they're one of the most oppressive groups having, you know, run across, gone outside of their, approved discussion parameters myself. Yeah, you just if you want to be in that party, you have to think and do very narrow conceptual
No, it's
thought
It's
patterns, let's
changed
just
over
say.
my life, though. I can tell you that much. I
Yeah.
watched it change the whole time.
Yeah.
I mean, again, it's like we can think about it's about thinking about how to reorganize. That's it's really important. And again, and understanding that power is organization, and that democracy is about you having the ability to decide what your life is going to look like. That it's just not imposed upon you, but that you decide what life looks like around you. That doesn't
Yes,
mean,
that's the ultimate freedom, right? And
yeah,
that's what
right,
really is what America stands for, as far as, even again, coming from where I live now in the Hudson Valley, that is what it was about. Can
yeah,
we live the way we want to live?
at its
Can
best,
we retain our earnings? Can we build the communities we want without shipping our wealth to other places against our will and against the ability for us to then use that money to build better communities, to use
right,
our time to build better communities? That is not what's, allowed right now.
right,
We have to ship our wealth elsewhere, and we are not allowed to think certain thoughts, and we're not allowed to meet in our town halls without the oppression of the national conversation. Yeah, so yeah, you're right, we just all have to
right.
start building an
So I
appreciation for the
mean, part
local.
of it
And I would urge
is
you, yeah,
yeah,
you
but I
should
mean,
just
part of
move
it is
to a small town.
yeah,
Joe,
yeah.
you need to move
Well,
to a
no, no,
small
no,
town.
no,
You're
you can't
living
do
in big
that. But
cities. What are you
look,
doing?
I think like revitalization of the uh, rural areas is like an imperative part of changing things. There's no
Yeah.
doubt about that. Yeah,
Yeah. All
I'd
right.
say that. All
All right,
right,
Joe. I guess we'll leave with that. Thank you so much,
all
and
right.
more soon.